Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation about gender norms. Very excited to be connected with Ricky Wilchins. Definitely impressed by her work. And I knew that we would be connected once I saw that lovely picture over her shoulder of the artist Romero Brito, Brazilian artist who is based in Miami. So that picture makes me very happy. But just a little bit about Ricky. I'd like to give a quick intro. Ricky is the executive director of True Child, which is a network of researchers and experts. Ricky has trained various agencies, the White House, CDC, Office on Women's Health, has worked extensively in DC, Chicago, LA, San Diego, San Jose. Hopefully we have some folks on the call from some of those locations. Also, Ricky's work has been profiled in the New York Times, and the Time magazine selected her as one of the 100 civic innovators of the 21st century. Ricky has published numerous books and research on gender norm in peer-reviewed journals. More recently, Ricky was selected by the Gates Foundation to their Bend of Gender Consultants. Ricky is an author of 6 books on gender theory and politics. The newest book, which I'm going to do a little show and tell, is on gender norms and intersectionality, which connects race, class, and gender. So with that, welcome, Ricky. And you know, we're so thankful everybody is coming into the space. We'd like to take a moment to do a quick poll and get an idea of who we have in the space with us. So Beth, would you be able to bring up the poll? Thank you.
Your wish is my command, Tamala.
Thank you so much, girlfriend. And we would like to use the poll and to get an idea, what area of juvenile justice field do you represent? So if you guys can take a moment to log in your answers, it would be appreciated.
Tamala, we've got a pretty tech-savvy audience. So far, we have 75% of the respondents have voted already.
Already?
Already.
That is impressive.
That is impressive. You let me know when you would like me to end the poll and show you the results. And we're at 87%, so.
Okay, maybe a few more seconds. The other folks.
Should I sing the Jeopardy song or should we forego that?
Let's do the Jeopardy song. I like your voice.
I was kidding. I'm not
Yeah, we can end it. Let's see who we have in the space with us.
Okay, here's the results.
Wonderful. We have, let's see, 64% of folks who are in the space with us are part of the court system. We have 4% who work in education, 4% in legal advocacy, 10% in child services, 8% as community partners, and 11% as others. So thank you guys so much. I mean, we definitely have a good mix of folks working with youth present today, and I'm sure everyone will be able to pull some of this information that you'll hear from Ricky today to take back to the young people that you work with. Beth asked, McGlory asked if I could hold the book up. I'll be holding it up again towards the end of the presentation. But just to get us started, I would love to maybe ask a couple of questions of Ricky before we get into the presentation.
Hey, Tamala, can I interject one thing? I was derelict in my duties before, and I apologize, but people, if they have questions, they should feel free to put those in the chat box.
Yes, please. Yeah, any questions or comments you have during the presentation, please put them in the chat box. And once Ricky ends the presentation, we will answer those questions. And I was remiss in introducing myself. I'm Tamala Meehan, Supervising Probation Officer and JDAI Coordinator for Cook County Juvenile Probation here in Chicago. So let's see, Ricky, I got a couple questions for you before we get started. The examination of gender norms and its intersectionality with race, class, and gender is so important to uplift in the work of child welfare and juvenile justice. Can you maybe share a little bit with us what pushed you to make this your life's work?
That's a question I ask myself an awful lot. And before I dive into that, Tamala and Beth, I want to just thank you both for stepping up to this and really putting this whole presentation together. I know it was a lot of work. And thank everybody for joining us today. Very exciting to see the turnout. I'm not really sure. I mean, I think being transgender is in itself kind of like getting a PhD in gender studies. But what really, I think, animated the work was a series of grants that we got from a visionary program officer at Ford named Lauren Harris to work around issues of masculinity and young Black men. And that series of grants really just kind of ate my organization and really directed us in a place that we kind of knew we needed to go but weren't sure how. And that really has become what's behind the work for the last 10 years. So it's always great when you have funders behind you who can actually see down the road that you're still traveling.
Wonderful, thank you. And let's see, as someone who is white identifying, what are you doing to educate and ground yourself as you are uplifting race and gender norm equity work and making suggestions for providing services for Black, brown, and other youth of color?
It's a great question. I was smiling when you mentioned briefing the CDC. I did not do that by myself. I grabbed one of my board members, Beverly Guy Sheftel, who teaches at Spelman College across town, and founded the Women's Center there, and dragged Beverly over to help, because that certainly isn't a briefing that I can do by myself. We partner with other folks on everything that we do, particularly around race and gender. For instance, Frontline Solutions, which specializes in work that impacts young African-American males, has partnered with us. If you go to the website, the truechild.org website, and see our paper on young Black men and masculinity, they co-authored every bit of it. The work we have up on the website, we did for Heinz Endowments, and a wonderful program officer named Carmen Anderson on young Black women and health and relationships, was co-authored by one of my favorite people in the world, a PhD at St. John's University named Dr. Seatta Wallace, who really has dedicated her life to working on issues that affect African-American youth around gender. She's worked with Mary J. Blige. She's worked on BET's Wrap It Up campaign. Her work's been called out in Time Magazine and on ABC News. So I've been really lucky to surround myself with some really high-powered people who can help me avoid some of the potholes.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think it's true in this work, you know, as well as any other work, we can't do it in a silo or in isolation. We have to continue to reach out to those in the community to assist us in kind of digging in and really understanding, you know, what we need to move the work forward. Thank you. And let's see, in your book, Gender Norms and Intersectionality, you expressed hope that it will be a bridge between theory and real world practice. In what ways do you hope that it informs and challenges juvenile justice practitioners?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not sure that I have an answer. Gender norms, we call it a race and gender responsive approach to juvenile justice, as far as I'm aware, hasn't really been tried. That's kind of the bridge that we're trying to be. The whole idea behind True Child was to take some of the research out there and pull it kicking and screaming into the frontline practitioners, like many of the fine people we have on this call. I mean, I'm not an expert in juvenile justice, although I may know something about gender. So the idea was to bring this knowledge to bear, and I think we're still finding out what that would look like. And that kind of is a great segue, and thank you for that, for a whole presentation that we have around bringing gender into juvenile justice work.
Yes. And I think just the time that we've spent in preparation for, you know, this webinar, it definitely has led me just both professionally and personally to start digging more into the work of gender norms. And I think anytime we start digging in, it really brings the awareness of maybe how much further we have to go. And I'm just trying to, I definitely will be digging more into your book, and also just recently sat in on a webinar about SOGI. So, just wanting to definitely, learn a little more just, personally, and then also, more of what I can bring to our jurisdiction and the work that we are doing, with young people to definitely expand beyond the spectrum of just LGBTQ youth and looking, like I said, again, beyond that piece.
Well, and the whole focus of our work, I mean, I think that people in juvenile justice, fortunately, are kind of really getting, that they need to be doing SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity expression. What seems to be missing is, how the other 90% of young people who pretty much do conform to traditional ideas for masculine and feminine are also impacted. We call this a revolution of the obvious. It's like everything that I'm going to say on this webinar, your audience already knows because they all made it through middle school when a lot of this hits. But somehow when we start doing programs and providing training and thinking about equity, we're getting better as a country, at least I hope we are, about thinking about race and class. But for some reason, gender gets siloed as either a women's issue or a gay and trans issue. So hopefully this webinar will help people think a little bit outside that box into the wider ways that gender norms connect with factors like race and class.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ricky. And I think this is a good transition for us to move into your presentation. So with that said, I am going to mute myself and stop my video, and you can begin. So without further ado, Ricky Wilchins.
Well, thank you. Let's see if we can share the screen properly without computer sound. And hopefully we're up. There we go. Yes, it looks like it went through. So I'm going to pop through the first slide. So if you look at some of the studies that have been done out there, what they seem to indicate is that child welfare systems generally are highly gendered and gendering systems. What that means is they tend to anticipate, reward, and even punish very specific kinds of masculinity in boys and femininity in girls. But as some researchers say, they essentialize, to use like the $10 word that academics have to use, they assume that gender is hardwired, that just all boys will become masculine and all girls will become feminine. And that prevents them from looking at more constructive ways that they might do masculinity and femininity. For instance, masculinity can mean, having lots of girlfriends and beating up on gay kids. It can also mean having a stiff upper lip, putting women and children first, and serving the regiment. Those are all different ideals of masculinity that circulate in different subcultures at different times. So the idea isn't that if we just did this gender-aware work, all the boys would suddenly be, what the word is, less manly, or the girls would be less feminine. The idea is just simply to try to help them gain a little critical distance on the kinds of masculinity and femininity they're doing and hopefully guide them toward more constructive ways. Since we already talked about issues around youth of color, I just want to echo something that Tamala touched on. I will not be speaking about youth of color from my personal experience because I don't have that experience. Everything that I know about this is based on studies and my own reading. And also, if you see on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, what we call a gender audit that we did of one of the country's largest child welfare systems, both the juvenile justice side and the foster care side. So everything that I'm doing comes from research and is not unique. Nothing here will be unique to youth of color, even though we'll be focusing on them. It happens across communities, although every community has their own specific resonance around gender. And finally, I just want to be extra sensitive to something that Lauren Harris used to remind me that, we're not just adding to the crisis discourse, particularly around young Black and Latino men, that we also make sure to hold up the resilience and strength that many young people across the spectrum bring to the challenges they face. So a little bit about terms and definitions. This next slide is all things that are often confused with gender norms. They are also things we will not be talking about very much. This is a great time to check your email if you want. Gender is a very overloaded term in the English language. Doesn't PowerPoint make you look cool? Gosh. And used in lots of different contexts and mistaken for lots of different things. So the first is sex. This is primary and secondary characteristics like chromosomes, hormones, and genitals. Gender identity, a useful term if you're talking about transgender or transsexual individuals who often feel a sense of conflict between their inner gender identity and their outer biological sex. I should say an inner sense of being male, female, or some combination. Sexual orientation, attraction to members of one or more sexes, who you love. And finally, LGBTQ. I often joke on my presentation that straight people do not try to memorize the acronym. As soon as you do, we will add additional letters to it. We're already experimenting with adding a Q on it, but we're not sure if that stands for questioning or queer, and we won't tell which one is right. And also the plus that seems to be sneaking in because more and more young people especially are identifying as non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid. So that seems to be a discourse that's very much in motion, and it keeps getting longer. So what I really do want to focus on today is gender norms. And for some reason, my slide, there we go, get stuck on that slide for some reason. And if Beth would want to try to play that video, I know I was having a little problem doing it, maybe just the first little bit of it, that would be great. And if not, Beth, I can kind of wing it.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. You just need you to stop sharing your screen so then I can share mine.
I'm sorry, you told me that too. Pause, share, done.
Okay. So not pause, but stop.
Stop, done.
There you go. So now I'll be able, with the grace of God.
Boy, we are all becoming Zoom Jedi in this moment, aren't we?
Stop crying. Stop with the tears.
Don't cry.
Pick yourself up. Stop with the emotion.
Don't be a pussy.
Don't let nobody disrespect you. Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth shut.
Nobody likes a tattletale.
Bros come before hoes.
Don't let your woman run your life.
You a bitch.
What a fag.
Get laid. Do something.
Be a man.
Be a man.
Grow some balls.
That's a great start. You can pause that if you want to stop that. Thank you for helping out there.
Sure. And then I'll need you to share your screen again and we'll be ready to roll.
Got it. Without sharing computer sound this time. All right. Hopefully we're back live. So that's a pretty good non-technical definition of what we mean when we say gender norms. And I think there's probably very little that went by that people on this call haven't heard at some point or heard said by other people. So gender norms are just these socially constructed ideals and expectations we all seem to have for how to do boy and girl, for how to be manly or womanly. I know that constructed often hits people wrong, but as I said, there are different versions of masculinity and different versions of femininity that circulate at different times and different intervals. Consider that just a couple hundred years ago, men actually wore hose and women did not show their ankles. So the definitions of what considered manly or womanly changed dramatically over time and place. And it's also, as Tamala mentioned, intersectional, which is just like the academic $10 word for meaning that systems of oppression tend to interact, or as one wonderful academic in California put it in his book, Racial Castration, he said, racial bias is always gendered and gender bias is always raced. Even if we don't see it or call it out, racial bias is always gendered and gender bias is always raced. So I'm going to be devoting most of my time to talking about gender norms here and then kind of looking from that into where we found this idea would affect juvenile justice outcomes. So gender norms are learned. I said they were constructed. They're also learned, especially during what some experts term the gender intensification period of 9 or 10 to 13, 14, 15, when belief in traditional gender norms starts to accelerate and the interest starts to, belief starts to accelerate and also solidify. Mastering masculinity in boys or femininity in girls is a key rite of passage and maybe the central act of socialization for nearly every adolescent. And yes, that is the that is the rapper Little Bow Wow kissing his guns there. I feel like I should have a rap name there. Gender norms take practice. This could be anyone. I happen to tear this from the Boondock site because I love his work. This could be any young kids. You can see he's making all these fierce faces, and his older brother peeks in and says, "Are you still practicing your thug mug?" And he goes, "Hey, keeping it real is hard work when you're cursed with cuteness." My daughter has been riding the same bus to school for years now, and she said, why are all the guys suddenly dropping the F-bomb? Everything is F this and F that. And I said, they are practicing a specific kind of hypermasculinity, and they know that swearing and public risk-taking is a core aspect of showing a kind of manly disregard for contemporary social mores. So she said, I hope it stops soon. I'm like, yeah, good luck on that. Gender norms affect behavior. This comes from a focus group about why young men and women have sex. You can see top 10 reasons for guys. Number 1, for fame. Number 4, something to brag on. Number 10, for my rep. For girls, 4 top reasons. So a boy will like me, to fit in, peer pressure, to get attention. So even in something as crucial and sensitive as first intimacy, how much of that is driven by what others will think of me and what is expected of me. So this is not a theoretical discussion at all. Beliefs drive behavior. We can't see normative attitudes, but they do tend to drive behavior, especially for young people. And then, of course, the impact of rigid gender norms, like so many things, is enhanced in low-income environments where gender codes on the street may be especially narrow and penalties for transgressing them can be extra harsh. Also enhanced in very high-income environments. When the president visited the Queen in England, imagine what would have happened to Buckingham Palace if the Queen had said, I think today I'm going to wear a suit and tie. Probably the entire country would have ground to a halt. I want to talk now about, I want to kind of push out that part about having impact. As I said, beliefs affect behavior. So when you think about traditional manhood as defined by qualities like strength, aggression, emotional toughness, the research says that there's a whole plethora of issues and attitudes that this affects in actual behaviors. Or as one researcher put it, specifically around juvenile justice, violence, delinquency, and criminal acts are not side effects, but rather the social practices by which a certain kind of hypermasculinity is publicly demonstrated and established. So not side effects, but the very social practices that establish certain kinds of masculinity. So the research says that the stronger young men tend to believe in that kind of masculinity, strength, aggression, toughness, so forth, more risk-taking across the board with drugs, weapons, sex, and so forth, more likely to drop out of school early, more likely to have lower labor force participation as adults, more violence kind of across the board, male-on-male violence, domestic or partner violence, and of course LGBTQ, and finally more likely to avoid trauma care. I remember one really passionate therapist in one of the systems saying, I can't heal these boys if they won't talk to me about it, and they're all ashamed that A, that someone got to them, quote unquote, by traumatizing them, but B, because asking for help or crying or sharing sad feelings is considered unmanly. So really core in thinking about trauma care for young men. And then similar effects for, I'm sorry, I'm laughing because the Disney characters, I keep telling my daughter it's basically the same princes, they just keep changing the hair and the dress. Effects on femininity from what I call the 3 Ds, being deferential, dependent, and desirable. Girls who have more strong belief in that kind of femininity, again, more likely to drop out of school early, to have unplanned pregnancies or tolerate abusive relationships, more likely to believe that real womanhood means finding and landing that older, stronger male partner who can support them economically and psychologically for the rest of their lives. Certainly true of my mom, who, went out to marry a doctor or lawyer, and that was really important, that she would never work another day in her life and could just depend on him to do everything. And then finally, girls also tend to avoid trauma care, also from shame. But unlike boys, with girls, trauma is often sexually related, and the studies say that girls feel that somehow they have brought it on themselves, and therefore they're too ashamed to talk about it. So again, kind of effects on kids. I mean, you could do this all day long. There's a lot of research on this stuff. A lot of really strong effects on individuals. Again, I don't think anything on this probably surprises anyone on this call. I think of those as kind of the bottom-up impacts of gender norms, but there are also these top-down or systemic effects. Probation, detention, and education across the board. For instance, when we did our gender audit, we found that it affected probation and referral, case adjudication, their interaction with educators, trauma care, and how it's provided, and of course, rehabilitation and socialization. So I'd like to dive just a little bit more into those top-down effects. And also, I forgot to say, they're especially important for dual status youth who go back and forth between foster care and juvenile justice. One of the things I think about is, my daughter is 14, and just how much time my partner and I have spent talking to her about, what it would mean to be a woman and what to do in personal relationships and what risks to take and, how to dress and just everything that you do to raise a child. But often dual status kids have never had that influence in a sustained way in their lives and are missing some of that. So really important to talk to them about it. So masculinity effect on systems. I think that these is really falling into at least three buckets. People who are in child welfare systems, just like people for that matter who are in education systems or in health systems, are modeling very specific kinds of femininity and masculinity, even if they're unaware of it, rewarding certain kinds of behavior or even punishing it. And they also carry their own internal biases, which again, going back to the earlier slide, racial bias is always gendered and gender bias is always raced. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm just picking some examples. Again, you could have a much longer slide or even a whole presentation on this. But we know, for instance, that youth of color in particular are more likely to be, young men of color, be punished for highly subjective attitude offenses, often called defiant behavior. This is particularly true as part of the school to prison pipeline, things that might let slide. A school safety officer, for instance, might let slide with a young middle-class white male, and they ding the young black man. As one educator said to me, he said, what happens is the first two are just, they were throwing shade, and then the third time they actually do something wrong, and that gets them suspended. And we know once they get suspended, the likelihood of them coming back drops dramatically. We know that young black and Latino males are seen on average as 4.5 years older than they actually are because of implicit race and gender biases. So a probation officer or someone else may think that they're having an altercation with an 18-year-old man. They're actually talking with a 13.5-year-old boy. We know that their probation is revoked at higher rates, even for the same or similar infractions. And then there's often an institutional intolerance for male weakness. We had stories of, even officers in the system, when a boy got beaten up, saying, you need to man up and fight back. Or if you cry, the whole big boys don't cry, you being a sissy. This idea that you have to kind of enforce this kind of hyper-masculinity, or kids are somehow not doing appropriate manhood. And often this is not, or I would say almost always, it's not because people are trying to do anything that's not correct. It's because often they have been taught this themselves, and it's second nature. You could do some of the same when you look at femininity effects on systems. Studies say that girls are, particularly girls of color, but girls generally are 170% more likely to be referred to a court for low-level status offenses, runaway, curfew, truancy, things that are often overlooked as boys will be boys. I saw one study that girls make only about 25% of these low-level status offenses, but fully 50% of those who find their way in front of a judge, because we expect a certain kind of submissive femininity from girls. Also more likely to have their probation revoked for technical reasons. And finally, similar to boys, girls of color are seen as about 3 years older than they actually are and treated accordingly. So again, you can kind of do this all day. There's more and more studies on the impact of gender and race, this intersectional approach. But what we know is that every aspect, every place where the system has contact with young people, modeling race and gender bias, behavioral rewards and punishments are all impacted by race, class, and gender. I do want to pause for a moment and just call out gender-responsive programming for girls, because it's become such an important issue in the juvenile justice space. I realize that, the system is still overwhelmingly devoted to the boys that come through, but I think more institutions are recognizing the need for gender-responsive services. Girls tend to have, obviously, different pathways into child welfare systems, different experiences of being in child welfare systems, and different pathways out. One of the things that's being looked at more carefully, of course, is poly-victimization. When I mentioned truancy, curfew violations, and so forth, often these are girls running away from sexual abuse in the home, and then they get re-victimized by the system because of behavior they're doing to avoid abuse, and then re-sexually abused by someone in the system. So that's something that we really need to be more sensitive about. At this point, over 90% of programs available in juvenile justice systems, the research says, were developed and normed on boys. And even those that are available for girls may be normed and developed on white girls. I remember one program up north that they did have one, it was a legacy program, they did have one gender responsive program. It was actually, it was about don't get pregnant, and it was also teaching them etiquette. Needless to say, they had nothing similar for boys about, don't get involved in teen pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy, and teaching boys etiquette. I was laughing because even the people delivering it realized it was a legacy program that had seen its day. But it gives you a sense of just how kind of far the curve we are when it comes to creating really gender-responsive programming for girls. I do want to have, and we're almost done, I know you all listen to an awful lot of content patiently. I do want to call out in this Black Lives Matter moment the kinds of dialogues we are finally having about issues of microaggression and equity. I know as an organization, we typically are called in to look at developing programs and collateral and so forth. And increasingly we're being asked, hey, will you do a survey? Will you talk to us about workplace equity? This is one of the surveys. It's actually up on our website. We have a gender and race footprint tool that helps organizations look at every part of their footprint, from how they hire to who is in charge to their vendor relationships. It's available for free on our website. But one of the things that I think people are realizing is that race and gender microaggressions that would have been okay 10 years ago are no longer okay. People are finally standing up and saying, hey, the goalposts have moved, and you cannot say that anymore. And I think that's long overdue. And we find this in all kinds of organizations. We just work with a nationwide STEM organization that finds high-paying jobs for youth of color who graduated high school. And they have exactly the same problem. So really across the board. There's also biases around women, LGBTQ folks, ethnicity, and of course immigration that filter through. And then particularly conflicts around women in power. This country still has a very fraught relationship around women in power. If you're too strong and you try to be a really tough leader, you're seen as cold and unfeminine, unfriendly. But if you try to be, more friendly and soft, you're seen as weak. So it's kind of a no way to win, a no-win situation for women in power. And then finally, what we find across the board when we conduct gender audits, and increasingly we're being asked to come in and do anonymous surveys so that people can really get a handle on what folks think. As useful as the audits are to find out what people really think, you need kind of a third party to come in, excuse me, and get people to answer honestly. But the four things that come up most often as shortfalls in creating more equitable workplaces is people tell us, look, they're not measuring this. There are no concrete goals on creating a more equitable workplace. We do not receive any regular trainings on this, or if we received the training on implicit bias, it was kind of a one and done, or they only did race, but they didn't do anything around gender. And then finally, there's no one accountable, someone whose job it is to make sure that we have goals, that we get training, that we measure regularly, and someone who reports right up to the top of the food chain. So those are the things that we find most typically. So we're almost at the end here, and Tamala will be happy that we actually have extra time for Q&A, which is always a good thing. But I want to again thank Tamala and Beth, and hopefully there'll be some questions about these three aspects around gender norms, how they impact youth bottom up, the youth's own belief systems, how those who are tasked with their welfare are also impacted, and finally how we can build more equitable workplaces. So I'm going to, I think I'm on the last slide. Oh, sorry, I got two more slides and then we're done. Sorry about that. I just added a couple of slides before we started. There is a very strong research base on this. When you Google masculinity and child welfare, you find about 15,000 studies. Google Scholar is a rough-edge tool at best, but throw out 90%, there's still thousands of studies. And you can do the same with femininity and child welfare. Holy moly, you got 130,000 articles. So lots and lots of studies, even if most of them aren't exactly on point. This is a place where researchers have really done their job. And we're back to Tamala's question at the beginning, how do we integrate this into juvenile justice practice? So I think of this as really one core question. Can providing training, policy change, and programming and surveys around race and gender norms, one, make staff more effective at their jobs, two, improve rehabilitation rates and recidivism and just overall social and emotional health among young people, and finally, of course, can it create more equitable workplaces? So thank you for hanging in there with me on those last two additional slides. And I really appreciate it and have loved doing this, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions. And Beth, I think this is the place where I stop share. So I'm going to do that. Hopefully I got this right. And there we go. Tamala, are you unmuting?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Hopefully everybody else can too.
Yeah, trying to get my video to come back up. So sorry, I don't know why it's not.
We've got
No,
you
you
on
look
video.
fine.
You're good.
Oh, you see me? Okay.
We totally do.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was such an informative presentation. I wanted to lift up a few questions that came in from the chat. And I hope I'll be pronouncing everyone's names correctly. But we did have a question from Rochelle Gabriel, wanting to know how important is it to address gender when looking on where to house juveniles brought into detention. They indicated that their county currently is placing youth on units that is based on their biological gender, but just wanted to know kind of best practices and norms.
It's a really good question. Again, I kind of want to focus more on the 90% of kids who do pretty much conform to gender norms, but I think it's a really important question. And what happens is when you assign young people based on biology instead of gender identity, you expose them to abuse by other kids. The best practice is certainly to assign young people based on how they identify and present themselves and not force them to be linked to their biology. This is going to become more pressing as kids find their way into systems who are actually non-binary, and most systems only have room for boy or girl. So we're going to start thinking about what we do for individuals coming in who are non-binary, genderqueer, or gender fluid. How do we handle them in ways that are equitable? Just having them being assigned by their genital status is not going to get us there, I don't think. But thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you. From Cheryl Bartnick, the question is, we find female residents in detention to start to experiment or talk about they are interested in other females when it wasn't like that on probation on the outside. How do you suggest we handle those situations? I think perhaps maybe if attraction may change for young people from when they were in the community versus to when they are maybe, you know, being held in a detention facility.
Interesting. I'm not sure I have specific guidance on what to do for same-sex attraction inside facilities. I think it's a really important question, but I'm not sure that I have specific guidance on what to do with that. You really do hope that the staff are trained to think about that if possible.
Thank you. From Shannon Wilbur, does gender-responsive programming for girls exclude youth who identify as non-binary or are masculine of center?
I have not seen very much programming that is gender responsive. Again, I'm not an expert on juvenile justice, but the few programs that I have seen pretty much assume A, that all the girls are female, and B, that the girls identify as girls. It would be really interesting to create that programming. I remember talking with a juvenile justice advocate in a very conservative state and said, you know, do you really want training for your staff on, you know, non-binary and gender fluid? And her response was, look, these kids are already coming through here. We're going to have to know how to deal with them. Even issues of pronouns, teaching staff to do they, them, and their. Just really simple things like that. We're going to have to rethink the model for non-binary kids because they're not going to stop. We're just going to get more of them, I think.
Okay. Another question, what are your thoughts on the DSM-5 diagnosis of gender dysphoria?
That is a whole PowerPoint.
That is a heavy question for sure.
That is a whole PowerPoint. Most people are not really familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that the Psychiatric Association updates every once in a while and uses to provide diagnoses of gender dysphoria so that transsexual identified people can get appropriate medical care. My one thought is, first of all, that we should eventually start moving it out of the diagnosis. I don't really believe that it's a diagnostic category. Certainly it is for some people, but most people are just seeking appropriate medical care. So I no longer think of this as a psychiatric illness, and it is a catalog of illnesses. They've made some steps. I'm going into high gear here to move it out of the paraphilias, which is nice, and to say it's not an illness. It's like if you're uncomfortable with it, which is kind of what they did with homosexuality. Some people in this call are probably old enough to remember when being homosexual was itself an illness, and then they depathologized it, and then they said, well, it's only if you're uncomfortable, which they called ego-dystonic homosexuality, and they finally just pulled it out entirely. I don't know if you want to transition, why you have to go get a letter from a doctor saying that you really, really, really want to transition, but that's like a whole other discussion for another day. Mm-hmm. And there are very strong feelings on either side. I will say that a diagnosis is still necessary for most people to get reimbursement from their insurance company for it to be covered, and that is a bridge that we have to think about. There may be some things that don't have a diagnostic category which are still necessary health issues. One of the things that is often compared to is women who have had breast cancer and then need reconstructive surgery for their breasts to feel whole. We don't call that, cosmetic. We call that needed. This may fall under the same category. It'll be interesting to see how that dialogue evolves.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Ricky.
I was just reading ahead of you. I so apologize. I just realized I used gender fluid and someone busted me and said, can you please explain your terms? I apologize. So if you don't mind if I hop ahead?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I have to tell a story. So this is how quickly things have changed. My daughter wanted to attend the Gay Pride Parade and with a couple of friends, and I said, really, that's really cool. And she said, yeah, I identify as pan. Alex identifies as gender fluid, and Ellen identifies as gender queer. And I was like, do any of your friends just kind of identify as, dumb old gay or transgender? Because I spent the last 25 years of my life trying to resuscitate these categories politically. So if they're over, I would really like to know. But kids are doing much more inventive things around gender. Non-binary means just what it says, a person, not necessarily a young person, but mostly who simply doesn't identify as male or female. If you're confused by this, you're not alone. One of the first public mentions we have of this is a young person, actually from India, I believe, who introduced themselves to Obama as being non-binary and talked about the fear of coming out. And Obama, who's probably as well briefed and informed a president as we've had in my lifetime, immediately went to his LGBT talking points because he did not know what she was saying, or they were saying, I'm sorry. So I think that's really interesting. So we're all still learning about how to think about non-binary. Gender fluid is just what it says, someone who alternates their gender expression depending on how they feel. And gender queer, I'm going to brag a little bit. Gender queer is actually a term that I that I coined a long time ago, which somehow caught on. It's the name of my second book. And seems to have gotten away from me. Genderqueer is being used in lots of different settings. I've seen non-binary people use it. I'm seeing people who are intersex sometimes use it, and even people who just are trying to clear gender and do interesting things that don't fit. The term that was used when I was growing up, excuse my my French, was gender FCK, if you fill in the blank, and that's what it was called. They were just doing things to mess around with gender. So the term has kind of gotten away. I'm really interested in see where it will go next. So I'm not sure we have a precise definition. But these are all three varieties of people who basically do not seem to see themselves on a strict binary of boy, girl, male, female, and are doing some combination of the two.
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Perfect. We have a question. What's the best way to assist parents who have challenges in communicating with their children who have gender norm struggles and involved in juvenile justice?
Oh, I wish I had that answer. We've been trying for the last year or so to actually pull together some collateral that might help with that, both for parents and frankly for professionals in the system. A self-survey guide that would help people get an inventory of their own race and gender biases, not to change them, but at least to help them be a little more aware. A gender norms toolkit to help them think through this in more depth, and even small group and one-on-one exercises they could use to launch these conversations. These are not easy conversations to have, and none of us has a degree, I assume, in talking about gender norms and race. So we're all trying to figure out some really difficult stuff together. Hopefully in the next year or so we will have some of that collateral and actually be able to test it. In fact, just briefly, here is a somewhat shameless plug. We are trying to pursue a couple of pilot projects around some of that collateral. So if you or someone on this call is in a juvenile justice system and think you might like to be a location for a potential pilot project, please feel free to reach out to the wonderful folks at JDAI and say, hey, if that goes forward, I would love to be a part of this. But I think we're still trying to learn, what would work. For parents specifically, just to get back to your question, I think coming with a degree of empathy and allowing that there are going to be things that you're not going to understand that your kids are doing is really important. Someone once said to me, how do I stay on top of this discourse? And I said, if you're over the age of 12, you're already behind and you will never catch up. So I'm marinated in this and I make mistakes. So it's moving very quickly. Yes. And I think we're all trying to play catch up. And I just want to say one last thing, since privilege has been lurking in the background of this webinar. you know, we all come with wrappers of privilege we can't see out of, and I think it helps if we all cut each other a little slack, particularly when it comes to issues of race and gender. We're all trying to figure out a lot of really challenging stuff together. And, you know, when people get my pronouns, you know, wrong or whatever, it's like I don't want people walking on eggshells. I want people to open up, and that's why I tell some of the silly jokes. I want them to relax. You can't learn when you're crouched over in a defensive position. You learn when you're open and you're having fun. So I know some of this conversation has probably been challenging, but I hope that folks will take it as something that's interesting and enjoyable and not as, oh my God, you know, compassion fatigue. I have to master yet another issue.
Yes, we have to practice grace with one another. It's like you said, this is a journey for sure.
Well said.
Yes. A question from Frederick Heather. Have you seen good examples of programs that model or reinforce positive things around gender and or are less or not gendered?
Not so much around not gendered or non-binary. There is some, so the gender norms dialogue has been slow to catch in the U.S. for some very interesting reasons. If you go abroad, they all do gender norms as part of their work routinely. In fact, most of the programs that we look at are in places like, you know, sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, where those in the global south realize that you have to address gender norms. Here in the U.S., we're way behind, which is why the Gates Foundation, as you mentioned, is launching a bench of approved speakers, which hopefully I will be one, to help, you know, bring people up to date. The one exception, interestingly enough, has been many of the organizations that are doing work around domestic and intimate partner violence. Futures Without Violence in California gets this. Men as Peacemakers in Duluth gets this. Certainly, you know, Men Can Stop Rape in DC, which has a series of posters called My Strength Is Not for Hurting. The My Strength posters were adopted by all 5 branches of the military for helping to change attitudes. So I think the domestic violence people have really realized we have to start thinking about reframing manhood. But outside of that, it's still like, you know, kind of hasn't quite made it to the current edge of best practice. Hopefully we'll have more of that with some of the pilots going on out there.
Thank you. We have a question from Michelle Lytle-Starad. Please forgive me if I butchered your name. How can we address courts and judges who are punishing girls' gender transgressions? What can we do about it from outside of the system?
It's a great question. I don't have that answer, I'm afraid. Girls and boys are both punished for stepping out of gender norms, and it can be something profound like saying, I really feel like a blank inside, and it can be something minor like, you know, after a certain age, you know, girls have this kind of enforced ladylikeness. No, that's not lady nice, and, you know, you're an embarrassment, and, you know, or with boys, of course, it's all man up and, you know, act like a man and so forth. I think what's really important is to intervene at those moments and slow down. Many of the people doing it don't know that they're doing it. They don't even realize it. My daughter, when she was growing up, would always hear, oh, what a pretty princess. Studies show that 80% of the compliments that young girls hear growing up are about their looks, their appearance, or their weight. 80%. So every time someone would say in the supermarket, oh, what a pretty little princess, I would say, yes, she's pretty and courageous and smart and strong and fast. The interesting thing with that is it works. People go, oh, well, of course, you know, but you say different things to boys and girls. Interestingly enough, by the time she got to be 10, she kind of knew that rap, and I would say, and I get the eye roll. It's like, oh, Mom, really? You know, like, enough. But we reinforce and punish boys and girls for different things, and what's important is that bystanders step in and say, wait a minute, let's look at that again and slow things down. You don't want to shame people. Shaming is not effective generally. You want to get them to think, and that takes pausing and engaging. By the way, I've been asked by the wonderful Women's Foundation of Central Ohio to mention that they actually, as far as I know, are the country's first self-identified gender transformative funder, and they actually reoriented their entire foundation around gender norms and have a wonderful training called Gender Bias, but Gender by Us, the pun is with BIAS, obviously. Gender bias that can be used for workplace equity. and women. So that's really great.
Wonderful.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left. We'll probably get a couple more questions in from Laura
Please,
Furr.
it's a great question.
Yes, can you direct us to any research of how adultism interacts with how the juvenile justice system ignores or rejects the SOGI realities for youth in the system?
Well, you know, if you just go to Google Scholar and type in sexual orientation or gender identity and juvenile justice, you get a whole bunch of materials. Interestingly enough, some of the organizations in the gay community, I'm thinking now of the Human Rights Campaign and the National Center for Transgender Equality, will come up really prominently in that list. Also probably LAM, the Legal Defense Fund, and the National Center for Lesbian Rights out in California. So all these groups are kind of really trying to promote issues around juvenile justice and being gay or transgender, because they recognize that this is a huge issue. It's difficult enough if you're from a low-income community and of color, but if you're gender nonconforming and gay or trans, you face a very steep road in child welfare systems. So luckily, they're starting to put out those materials. And I think I probably made clear what we're missing again is how to how to do similar work with the other 90% of kids who are not gay or trans. But hopefully that's coming soon.
Wonderful. We have one last question before we wrap up from Monica Miles Steffens. What is the website to find the organizational tool that you mentioned in your presentation?
All of our collateral, all these papers that I mentioned are up on our website at truechild.org. TRUECHILD, just the way you would think. If you go to the Our Reports page, the very first thing you'll see is the Gender Equity Footprint Tool. I'm not sure that anonymous surveys up there, because usually people bring us in to do, you can't kind of do an anonymous survey yourself very well. Our paper on young black women, young black men, young Latinas. In fact, our paper on feminine norms in young Latinas has just been translated into Spanish. So that's really cool. So all that collateral is all up there and free for download. Please feel free to share it widely. That's what it's up there for. And a whole bunch of other really good reports around gender norms as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That's the last of the, actually one question just came in, and I was going to hold up Ricky's most recent book on gender norms and intersectionality. And we will be randomly selecting someone to send a copy of this book to, so be on the lookout for that lucky person. But I would like to thank you, Ricky, for your presentation. This has been such a privilege to be able to share space. It's been very informative for me, and I look forward to learning more. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to join us for today's presentation. When you exit out, you will be taken to a survey, and we're hoping that everyone can take just a quick moment to fill out the survey. The recording of this conversation will be on JDAIconnect, so feel free, if you want to take another peek, feel free to share it with your peers. And I encourage us all to continue this important conversation and dialogue on JDAIconnect. But thank you all so much. Wishing you all a great day, and be well.
Thank you, and thank Beth so much for all your hard work on making this happen.
Take care, everyone.